The floor of the Amber-Glow Citadel was slick, with the crushed rubies of 99 desperate women, and I was the 100th. Every single one of them had walked through those doors carrying mountains. I walked through carrying bread. Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. I still remember the smell of that corridor, cold stone and old candle wax, undercut by something I could not name, something hollow, like a room that hasn't been breathed in for a very long time. 100 years, as it turned out. That's how long the Amber-Glow Citadel had been holding its breath. The century husk curse, they called it. I had grown up hearing about it in hushed tones in the barren valley, the way you speak about a scar on the face of the world that never quite healed. They said the king sat on his obsidian throne the way stone sits at the bottom of a river. Still, patient, utterly unfeeling. His skin had gone the color of quarry slate sometime in his second decade of the curse. His heart still beat, they knew, because he was still breathing, but only once every hour. One slow, reluctant thud, like a clock no one had remembered to wind. He could hear everything. He could see everything. He simply could not feel any of it. Not the warmth of a fire, not the weight of his own crown, not the difference between a kiss and a closed fist. I thought about that a lot, in the weeks before the offering of tithes, what it must be like to live inside a body that had become its own prison. Not death, death would have been kinder. This was something slower, something more deliberate, like being sealed behind glass and left to watch the world go on without you. And then the offering came. The continent's finest families sent their daughters up those steps like prayers silk-wrapped, jewel-laden, drenched in perfume and ambition, each one carrying something that would have made a lesser king weep with gratitude. Lady Maven of the Gold Coast arrived with a chest so heavy it took 4 men to carry it, packed to the lid with uncut emeralds the color of shallow seawater. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, perfectly arranged, built for admiration. She curtsied and smiled and said all the right words in the right order. The king did not look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the far wall, on a crack in the stone that had probably been there since before any of us were born, and his expression held all the warmth of a tomb door at midnight. The 98th girl brought blood gold, the rarest metal on the continent, hammered into the shape of a wolf mid-howl. The artistry was staggering. The king's finger lifted once from the arm of his throne. His chamberlain stepped forward and accepted it on his behalf. The king never touched it. He never touched any of it. The 99th. I watched her from the servants' corridor where I had no business being. I watched her lay a crown's ransom at his feet and watched him look straight through her like she was made of smoke. And I felt something crack open in my chest, not pity for her, exactly, more like grief, the dull, heavy kind that has no obvious object, because I could see it so clearly from where I stood, all those women, all that wealth, and not one of them had brought him anything he could actually use. Not one of them had tried to feed him. The bread was in my apron pocket. It had been since morning. I'd baked it in the kitchen before dawn, the way my mother taught me, slow risen, heavy with seeds. The crust scored 3 times for luck. I hadn't planned to bring it in there. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that hall. I was a disgraced handmaiden, emphasis on disgraced, with no name worth speaking in those corridors, no family title, no dowry, no business standing within 100 feet of an alpha king. But the 99th girl walked out with empty hands and an unbroken back, and I thought, what does a man who has spent a century feeling nothing actually need? Not jewels, not weapons, not another beautiful face that would fade into the gray the moment she left the room. He needed something warm. He needed something that smelled like a kitchen fire and a living world and a woman who had put her hands into something and made it real. He needed to be fed. So I walked through those doors, flour still on my dress, heart going so loud I was certain the entire court could hear it. The murmurs started immediately. Who is she? Where are her people? what on earth is that she's holding, and I let them talk, because there was nothing I could do about it anyway. I walked to the foot of the obsidian throne. I looked up into the face of a man who had not felt the sun on his skin in 100 years. His eyes were the gray of deep water, not empty, not quite, but distant in the way of something that had learned not to hope. The scars on his jaw caught the torchlight. His crown sat heavy on dark hair, indifferent as a stone. I held out the bread. "I didn't bring you anything worth counting," I said, "because I've never been able to hold my tongue when I'm frightened. But I thought you might be hungry." The court went absolutely silent. And then King Valen Alpha, king of the Amber-Glow Citadel, ruler of the 5 territories, the man who had not felt anything in 100 years, reached out with a hand the color of old stone, and he took the bread from me. The moment his fingers closed around it, something cracked. Not the bread, not the silence. Something in him, something deep and sealed and long forgotten, fractured open, and the sound it made was not a sound at all. It was warmth. A thread of it, thin as a candle flame in a very large room, but real, unmistakable. His eyes found mine, and for the first time in a century, they were not distant. They were afraid, and wondering, and entirely, completely awake. I didn't know then what I was. I didn't know about the aethel blood, or the sun grain my mother had kneaded into every loaf since I was a child, or the curse that Baron had been feeding on like a parasite for 100 years. I didn't know any of it. All I knew was that a king made of stone had just tasted salt for the first time in a century, and he was looking at me like I was the most terrifying, impossible thing he had ever seen. Which, as it turned out, was the most honest thing anyone had offered him in a very long time. Chapter 2. The Handmaiden's Shadow. He didn't speak. He just stood up. You have to understand, in a hall full of people who had been holding their breath for 3 days, that single movement hit like a thunderclap. 99 women had knelt before that throne and received nothing. Not a word, not a glance, not the smallest flicker of acknowledgement. And now this man, this stone king, this living ruin of a person was on his feet, because of me. Because of bread wrapped in a kitchen cloth that I'd been gripping so hard my knuckles had gone white. He didn't look at the court. He didn't explain himself or issue a command or perform any of the rituals a king is supposed to perform when he moves through a room. He simply walked slowly, like someone relearning the weight of their own body toward the corridor behind the dais. And then he stopped at the threshold and turned his head, just slightly, just enough for me to understand that the waiting was for me. I should have run. Every sensible bone in my body was screaming at me to turn around, walk back through the servant's door, and spend the rest of my life pretending this morning had never happened. I was a disgraced handmaiden. I had no title, no family name worth speaking in these halls, no protection of any kind. The court was already murmuring. I could feel their eyes on my back like the tips of knives, confused and hungry and looking for someone to blame. But I followed him, because when something that has been silent for 100 years finally moves toward you, you don't walk away from it. You walk toward it and you find out what it was trying to say. The inner sanctum was at the end of a corridor so long and so cold it felt like walking through the spine of the mountain itself. No tapestries, no torches lit, just bare stone and the sound of my own footsteps and his, and the terrible, enormous quiet of a room that hadn't been breathed in for decades. He stood at the center of it and turned to face me, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then I saw it. Along the back of his right hand, where his fingers had closed around the bread, where his skin had grazed mine for just a fraction of a second, the gray was retreating. The stone-colored skin that had swallowed him whole over a century was pulling back, slow and certain, like frost melting off a window. Underneath it was something warm, unmistakably, impossibly warm. The faintest trace of living color, spreading in silence, the way a single candle will slowly push back a very large dark. He was staring at his own hand like he didn't recognize it, like he was watching a stranger's fingers. And I felt something break open in my chest that I didn't have a name for, not pity, not wonder, something older than both. The grief of seeing someone remember they were alive. I wanted to say something. I had no idea what. Every sentence I started in my head collapsed before it reached my mouth. What do you say to a man who has just felt warmth for the first time in 100 years? What do you say to someone whose face is doing that, trying to feel something and not yet knowing how, like a muscle that has long forgotten its own use? Baron arrived before I found the words. I had heard his name whispered in the kitchens the way you whisper about a bad winter with resignation and a specific kind of dread. High Priest Baron, the king's most trusted spiritual counsel, the man who had spent a century at the king's side, interpreting the curse, managing the court, keeping the kingdom from fracturing entirely while its ruler sat hollow on his throne. He swept into the sanctum like weather, tall and unhurried, his deep violet robes absorbing the dim light, his face arranged into an expression of practiced concern that didn't reach his eyes. Nothing ever reached those eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that feeling things was a disadvantage he could not afford. She has poisoned you. His voice was very calm. That was the worst part, how calm it was. Not alarmed, not confused, certain, as though he had already decided what this was before he walked through the door. Whatever she administered through that bread is already in your system. We need to remove her from this room and contain the damage before... Poisoned! I heard myself say the word out loud before I could stop it. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I baked that bread before dawn, in the palace kitchen, with my own hands. You're welcome to taste what's left of it. He didn't look at me when I spoke. That was deliberate. That was a man communicating, very clearly, that I was not a person in this room. I was a problem, an object requiring disposal. The specific contempt of someone who has never had to explain themselves to anyone they considered beneath them. Arrest her, he said to the 2 guards who had materialized at the doorway, before whatever she has administered goes any deeper. I felt the breath leave my body. I felt the walls of that cold room press inward. I had walked into the lion's den carrying a loaf of bread and somehow been surprised to find teeth. And then Valen spoke. One word, low, unhurried, absolute, the voice of a man who had not spoken in so long that when he finally did, the silence itself seemed to flinch. No. The guards stopped. Baron went very still. She stays. No explanation, no justification, just those 2 words, dropped into the room like stones into still water. And in the silence that followed, Baron's gaze moved slowly, deliberately to the back of the king's hand, to that small, impossible bloom of warm skin spreading where the gray had been. I watched his face as he looked at it. I watched for surprise, for confusion, for any of the reactions a person has when they see something they don't understand. There was none of that. What moved behind those eyes was something else entirely, something he extinguished almost immediately, almost before I could name it. Fear, old, specific, and very carefully hidden. He knew what the bread had done, not as a guess, not as a suspicion. He knew, which meant he knew what it meant. Which meant that whatever had been done to this king, whatever century-long darkness had been wrapped around him like a second skin, Baron understood it from the inside. I didn't let my face change. I didn't let him see that I'd seen. I just stood there in my flower-dusted dress in the cold inner sanctum of the Amber-Glow Citadel, and I filed that small, devastating piece of knowledge somewhere deep and safe. The way you file away a sharp thing, carefully, and somewhere you will absolutely not forget. Chapter 3. The Secret of the Sun Grain. He asked me where I was from. That night, in the inner sanctum, with no fire in the hearth and the cold pressing in from every wall, and the two of us sitting on opposite sides of a room that had not held a living conversation in a very long time. He asked the way a man asks when he has genuinely forgotten how questions work carefully, like he was handling something he might break. I told him. The barren valley. 2 words that, in most rooms, produced a particular kind of silence. The polite, pitying kind. The silence of people who have never been hungry but understand, in an abstract way, that hunger is a real thing that happens to other people in other places. Valen didn't give me that silence. He just waited. And somehow that was worse and better than anything else he could have done. So I told him the real answer, the one I had never said out loud to anyone, because there had never been anyone worth saying it to. I told him about my mother's kitchen, about the smell of it, wood smoke and dried herbs and something faintly sweet that I could never identify as a child and only understood much later. About the way she baked in the dark before dawn, when the rest of the valley was still sleeping, moving through the kitchen like a woman performing a ritual she had performed 1,000 times. She never measured anything. Her hands just knew. Flour, water, salt, and then, from a small tin box she kept hidden beneath the 3rd floorboard from the door, a pinch of seeds so small they were almost invisible. She'd knead them in without ceremony, without explanation, and then she'd shape the loaf and score it 3 times and slide it into the oven and wait. I asked her once what was in the box. I was 7, maybe 8. Old enough to notice that the box existed, young enough to think everything my mother did was either ordinary or magical with no space in between. She looked at me for a long time before she answered. Then she knelt down and took my hands in both of hers hands that were always warm, always dusted with flour, hands that felt like the safest place in the world, and she said, "Sun grain." The last of it, from before the famine. And then she made me swear. Not the way parents make children swear to silly things. She made me swear with a weight behind it, looking directly into my eyes. Like she was pressing the promise into the part of me that would remember it when the rest of me had forgotten everything else. Guard the seeds. Use them only in the bread. Never tell anyone where they came from. I thought she was grieving. I thought it was the way people hold on to the last splinter of something they have lost, not because the splinter is useful, but because letting go of it means admitting it is truly gone. I thought my mother was a woman who loved old things and couldn't release them. I didn't know she was a soldier. I didn't know she had been fighting a war her whole life in a kitchen before sunrise, and that the bread was her weapon, and that she had been aiming it at a curse she would never live to see broken. She died the winter I turned 15, not dramatically, just quietly, the way people die when they have been slowly running out of everything for too long. She got cold and she didn't get warm again. That was all. The valley took her the way it took everyone eventually, incrementally, with patience, like it had all the time in the world. I kept the tin box. I kept baking the bread. I didn't know why except that it was the last instruction she ever gave me and I was not ready to disobey it. When I finished telling Valen all of this, the box, the seeds, the oath, my mother's hands, the sanctum was very quiet. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly bowed, and he was looking at the floor with the expression of a man receiving news he already suspected but had hoped, desperately, was wrong. I watched him put it together the same way I was putting it together, slowly, piece by piece. The sun grain declared extinct by royal decree a century ago. The barren valley, the only land capable of growing it, systematically starved into ruin. A famine that wasn't weather and wasn't misfortune but was, when you laid the pieces side by side and stood back and looked at the shape of them, a decision. Someone's deliberate, calculated decision to make sure the antidote never reached the king. Baron's decree, issued in Valen's name. While Valen sat sealed inside his stone body and couldn't feel, couldn't question, couldn't refuse. My mother didn't die in a famine. She died in a conspiracy. My valley wasn't abandoned by fate. It was sacrificed. We were all sacrificed, Every cracked field, every empty table, every child who went to bed with their stomach folded in on itself so that one man could keep feeding on a king's hollowness undisturbed. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I had done my crying for the barren valley a long time ago, alone, in ways that left marks I still carry. What I felt in that moment was something different, something colder and cleaner and more purposeful, the feeling you get when scattered, senseless pain suddenly arranges itself into a shape you can name. Rage, quiet, focused, and entirely patient. Valen lifted his head and looked at me. The warm patch of living skin on the back of his hand had spread to his wrist now, pushing back the gray inch by slow inch, and his eyes held something raw and present and entirely unguarded, the eyes of a man confronting a debt he did not choose, but would spend the rest of his life repaying. "How many people died in that valley?" he asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. I held his gaze. I didn't soften it for him. He didn't deserve softening, and more than that, he didn't want it. He wanted the truth the same way a person wants a wound cleaned, because it hurts less than leaving it. "Enough," I said. "More than enough." He nodded once, slowly. And in that nod, in the way his jaw tightened and his eyes dropped and his whole body seemed to take on weight it had not been carrying a moment before, I saw something I had not expected to find in a king encased in stone. Guilt. Real, unperformed, bone-deep guilt. And I thought, good, carry it, because the people it belongs to cannot carry it anymore. Chapter 4. The Altar's Betrayal. Baron moved the way powerful men move when they are losing, not with panic, but with the slow, deliberate precision of someone rearranging the furniture so you won't notice the walls are on fire. 2 days after Valen kept me in that sanctum, after the warm color had crept all the way to the king's forearm, Baron appeared at breakfast with a proposal. He called it the purity ritual. He delivered it with his hands folded and his voice measured and his face arranged into an expression of deep, sorrowful devotion, the face of a man doing something painful because he loves you too much not to. I did not trust a single syllable of it. The purity ritual, Baron explained to the assembled court, was an ancient rite reserved for moments of spiritual contamination. When a king had been exposed to corrupting influences, low-born energies, untested bloodlines, ungoverned magic, the ritual served to cleanse him, to reset him, as it were, to his proper spiritual state. It required the king to stand at the great altar of scales at midnight, alone, and submit to a purification that would burn away anything foreign that had attached itself to his soul. He said the word foreign with his eyes on me. Just for a moment, just long enough. The court received it the way courts receive things, dressed in the language of tradition and holiness, with solemn nodding and the particular relief of people who have been given permission to believe what they already wanted to believe. Of course the handmaiden had introduced something impure. Of course a low-born girl with no lineage and a kitchen loaf had no business altering a king. Of course Baron, who had guided them faithfully through a century of difficulty, knew what was right. I watched Valen's face through all of it. He sat at the head of the table with more color in his skin than he'd had the day before, his left hand now almost fully returned to living flesh, the gray retreating toward his shoulder in slow defeat, and he listened to Baron with an expression I was beginning to learn to read, still on the surface, turbulent underneath. A man who was waking up after a very long sleep and finding that the room had been rearranged while he was under, and was not yet sure enough of himself to say so out loud. That was the part that frightened me most. Not Baron, not the ritual, Valen's uncertainty. A century of being told he was hollow, being managed and contained and spiritually guided by the very man who had built his cage that doesn't just wash off because a girl brought you bread. The damage goes deeper than the skin. It lives in the place where your own voice used to be, in the silence where your instincts once spoke, and it whispers, maybe he's right. Maybe you need this. Maybe you are the problem. I had seen that particular doubt before. I grew up watching it in my valley, the way people who have been hungry long enough start to believe the hunger is their fault. The way suffering, if it lasts long enough and goes unnamed long enough, starts to feel like character rather than crime. That night I found the records. I wasn't supposed to be in the archive. I wasn't supposed to be in half the places I'd been since walking through those throne room doors, but Baron's quarters adjoined the East Library, and the East Library's lock was old, and the window latch was older, and I had spent enough years being underestimated to know how to move through a building without being seen. It took me less than an hour to find what I was looking for, because Baron was meticulous, organized, the records of a man who had never expected anyone to come looking. A century of notes, written in his careful hand, charting Valen's deterioration with the cool precision of a farmer tracking a harvest. Not a cure he had been working toward, a timeline. How much stone each year, how many heartbeats per hour, at what point the mind would go, at what point only the shell would remain. At what point the battery would be fully sealed and permanent, and he wasn't trying to cure the king. He had never been trying to cure the king. The purity ritual wasn't a cleansing. It was the final lock, the last turn of the key that would take whatever fragments of Valen had begun to return the warmth, the voice, the waking mind, and extinguish them forever, permanently, irreversibly, leaving behind a body of living stone that would power Baron's immortality until the mountain crumbled. I sat on the cold library floor with those pages in my lap, and I let it land. All of it. A century of manufactured suffering. A kingdom bled. A valley starved. A king slowly eaten alive by the one person sworn to protect him. And every single person in that citadel sleeping peacefully tonight because they believed, with their whole hearts, that the man in the violet robes was holy. I thought about my mother, about those pre-dawn hours in the kitchen, alone, kneading sun-grain into bread by firelight while the valley slept and the cold pressed in, and she kept going anyway. She had known, on some level, she had known the bread mattered, even when she had no language for why. She had kept the faith of it in her hands when her mind couldn't hold the whole shape of it. I folded the pages carefully, tucked them into my apron, the same apron that had carried the bread 2 days ago, the same pocket that had held the thing that cracked a century of darkness. Then I stood up, and I smoothed my dress, and I walked back through the dark corridor toward the inner sanctum. Valen was still awake. He looked up when I entered, and something in his face shifted relief, I think, though he would not have named it that yet. He was still learning the names for what he felt. I set the pages on the table between us without a word and let him read. I watched his face go through every stage of it, confusion first, then comprehension, then something so far past anger it had no name. His jaw tightened until the muscle jumped. His hands, one still gray and one now warm and human, pressed flat against the table. And then he went very, very still in the way of something that has just decided, with complete and total clarity, exactly what it is going to do next. The purity ritual was scheduled for midnight tomorrow. We had one day. Chapter 5, The Breaking of the Husk. I have tried, many times since that night, to find the right words for what the great altar of scales looked like at midnight. The closest I can get is this: it looked like a place that had been waiting. Not for the ritual, not for Baron, for something older than both, something the stone itself remembered even when the people inside it had forgotten. The altar chamber was vast and tiered, rising in concentric rings of carved black stone toward a ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. 100 candles burned in iron brackets along the walls, and their light did not warm the room, it simply revealed it, the way lightning reveals a landscape, cold and total and without comfort. The court stood in their places along the outer ring, still and silent, dressed in their formal witness colors. Baron stood at the altar's center in full ceremonial robes, The dark artifact, a disc of obsidian carved with symbols I did not recognize and did not want to held open in both hands like an offering. Valen stood 10 feet from me, at the edge of the inner ring, and he was already beginning to gray again. That was what Baron had counted on. Proximity to the artifact accelerated the curse. Without me beside him, without the sun-grain bread still working through his system, the stone was reclaiming him, climbing back up his arm, creeping toward his jaw, slow and patient and absolute. He was fighting it. I could see him fighting it, standing rigid, hands fisted at his sides, jaw set. But a century of damage does not reverse in 2 days, and Baron had designed this moment carefully. This was the part where the king was supposed to be too far gone to resist. Baron began to speak. Old words, in a language I didn't know, in a voice that resonated against the stone the way sound resonates in a place designed to amplify it. The obsidian disc began to pulse. A gray mist rolled out from it across the floor, thin as breath at first, then thickening, and where it touched the stone rings it left a faint residue, the same dead, slate color as the skin it had spent a century building on Valen's body. I watched the mist reach the outer ring. I watched 2 of the court witnesses go still, too still, their faces smoothing into blankness, their bodies locking in place. Stone. Baron was petrifying the entire court, sealing his witnesses, eliminating every variable. By the time the ritual completed, there would be no one left in this room who could contradict whatever version of events he chose to tell. I want to tell you I wasn't afraid. I want to give you the version where I stood in that mist and felt nothing but certainty and righteous fire. But the truth is, my hands were shaking and my heart was going so hard I could feel it in my back teeth, and I was gripping my bread knife, my kitchen bread knife, the one I used to score loaves before dawn like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The mist reached my feet. I felt it, a cold that wasn't temperature, a heaviness that pressed on the skin like the beginning of sleep, like something trying to convince my body that stillness was the natural state of things. I took 1 step forward, then another, toward Valen, toward the altar, into the thickening gray. And that is when it happened. I don't know how to explain the aethal blood to someone who has never felt it wake up. It is not like anger, and it is not like courage, though it wears the colors of both. It started in my sternum, a warmth, sudden and total, like swallowing sunlight, and then it moved outward through every vein in my body in one long, silent, unstoppable wave. My skin began to glow. Not brightly, not dramatically. The way bread glows when it's just right amber and deep and alive from the inside, the color of something nourishing and ancient and entirely real. The gray mist recoiled from it, physically, like smoke retreating from a flame. Baron's voice stopped mid-word. I kept walking, toward Valen. The warmth in my blood was building now, not burning. Nothing like burning, it was the feeling of a hearth fire in a room that has been cold for a very long time. The feeling of food reaching an empty stomach. The feeling of being recognized after years of being invisible. It was every tender thing condensed into light, and it was pouring out of me into the gray air of that chamber and eating the darkness as it went. I reached Valen and I put both hands on either side of his face. His skin was almost fully stone again, cold as a riverbed in January. His eyes were the only living things left in it, deep gray and desperate, and locked on mine with an expression that broke something in me completely open. Not fear, not pain, something past both of those. The look of a man who has spent 100 years in the dark and can see a light and cannot yet believe it is real, and is terrified, more terrified than he has ever been of the dark, that it might go out before he reaches it. I pressed my forehead to his. I felt the cold of the stone against my skin, and I let the warmth in my blood answer it. And I said the only true thing I had. I said, I've got you. I've got you. You are not alone in this anymore. The wolf answered. Not gradually, not tentatively. It answered the way something answers when it has been waiting a very long time, and finally, hears the right voice call its name. From somewhere beneath the stone, beneath the century of silence and siphoning and slow extinction, something vast and ancient and furious drew one enormous breath and roared. The sound did not come out of his mouth. It came out of everything. The floor cracked in a starburst pattern from where he stood. The candles on the walls blew sideways. The gray mist didn't retreat this time. It shredded, torn apart from within, and the pieces of it dissolved in the gold light flooding the room, flooding from Valen, flooding from the place where my hands met his face and his wolf met my blood, and 100 years of manufactured hollow finally, catastrophically, gave way. The stone skin didn't fall off. It exploded, outward, in fragments that turned to dust before they hit the floor, and where each piece had been was warmth, living, breathing, human warmth, until he was standing in the ruins of his own curse, with his chest heaving and his eyes wide and color flooding back into every part of him, like water rushing into a dry riverbed after rain. Baron screamed. A real scream, not a command, not a ritual word, the scream of a man feeling something he had taken from another person come back to claim him. The obsidian disc cracked down the middle. The symbols on it went dark. His immortality, fed a century on stolen feeling, collapsed the way a fire collapses when you remove its fuel all at once, completely, leaving nothing behind but ash and cold air and a very old man crumpling to the altar floor. The petrified court thawed in the silence that followed. Stone faces softened back into skin. Hands that had been locked in place fell free. Someone in the outer ring began to cry, the shocked, helpless kind, the kind that comes when your body processes something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Valen lowered his forehead back to mine. His hands came up and covered both of mine, still pressed against his face, and he held them there. His skin was warm, impossibly, finally, completely warm. His heart was beating not once an hour, not once a minute, but the steady, unhurried rhythm of a living man standing in the present tense. He didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did I. There was nothing that needed saying. Some things are too large for words, and this was one of them, a century of darkness, ending not with a battle cry or a speech or a sword through the villain's chest, but with two people pressing their foreheads together in the ruins of a lie, and one of them saying, "You are not alone," and meaning it, completely, down to the bone. Chapter 6. The First Meal. The ivy appeared first. Nobody planted it. Nobody could explain it. 3 days after the altar, 3 days after the stone broke and the wolf roared, and Baron's obsidian disc cracked down the middle on the floor of the great chamber, a single thread of green appeared at the base of the stating office. Citadel's east wall, thin as a whisper, tender as a new thought. By the following morning it had doubled. By the end of the week, the entire east face of the Amber-Glow Citadel was laced with living green, ivy and soft moss, threading themselves between the ancient stones like the palace was being slowly, gently, remembered by the earth. The court didn't know what to make of it. They stood in the courtyard and stared upward with the bewildered expressions of people watching something impossible happen at a pace too slow to argue with. I understood it. I think I had understood it before it happened, the way you understand something in your chest before your mind has the language for it. The citadel had been sealed the same way Valen had been sealed. The curse hadn't just hollowed out the king, it had hollowed out everything that lived in his orbit, and now, with the hollow gone, the living world was simply coming back, finding its way through the cracks, doing what living things do when the thing that was suppressing them is finally removed. It grows back. That's what I kept thinking, walking through the corridors and watching the green push through the mortar and the light come differently through windows that had only ever known gray. It grows back. Given the chance, given the removal of whatever was killing it, life simply grows back. It does not need to be coaxed or convinced or carried. It just needs the obstruction gone. I thought about my valley, about the cracked earth and the empty fields and my mother rationing flour by firelight. I thought about the seeds in the tin box, how they had waited, patient and dormant and quietly undefeated, through decades of deliberate ruin. I thought, we grow back too. People grow back too. If someone stops taking from us long enough for us to remember what we are. Valen found me in the kitchen on the 7th morning. Not summoned found. He had walked through the entire citadel looking for me, which I knew because the head cook told me with enormous eyes and a voice pitched 3 registers above normal, because kings did not walk through kitchens. Kings did not walk anywhere without announcement, and this particular king had apparently stood in the doorway of the scullery for a full minute before anyone thought to direct him to where I was. He looked different in daylight. Fully returned to himself now, warm skin, dark hair, the scars on his jaw catching the morning light, but different from how I had imagined a king would look when the curse broke. I think I had expected something more regal, more declarative. Instead, he stood in my kitchen doorway looking like a man who had just woken from a very long sleep and was still slightly uncertain which parts of the world were dream and which were real. Uncertain and careful, and more present than anyone I had ever stood in a room with. He looked at the bread cooling on the board. He looked at me, and then he said, quietly, "May I sit?" Not a command, a question. From a king, in his own palace, to a handmaiden a question, offered with the same tentative, genuine courtesy you offer someone when you understand, perhaps for the first time, that the space you are entering belongs to them as much as it belongs to you. I pulled out the chair across from me. He sat. I cut the bread scored 3 times, the way my mother taught me, the way I had done every morning since I was old enough to hold a knife, and I set half of it in front of him without ceremony. No plate, no silver, just bread on a plain wooden table between 2 people who had each, in their own way, survived something that should have finished them. He picked it up, brought it to his mouth, and when he took that first bite, I watched him close his eyes, just for a moment. The expression on his face was not the expression of a king tasting food. It was the expression of a man returning to something he had almost forgotten was possible. The expression of someone being simply and completely nourished. I felt the tears before I knew I was crying. Not sad tears, I want to be clear about that. The other kind. The kind that come when something you have been quietly carrying for a very long time is finally allowed to put itself down. We didn't speak for a while. We just sat there in the morning light with the bread between us and the sound of the kitchen around us and the ivy growing quietly up the wall outside the window, and it was the most peaceful I had felt in as long as I could remember, maybe ever. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unhurried, like a man choosing words he had been turning over in his mind for several days. Every woman who came through those doors brought me something they thought would make me feel powerful, he said. Emeralds, blood gold, weapons, bloodlines. They brought me things you accumulate, things you display, things that prove, to anyone watching, that you matter. He paused, looked down at the bread in his hands. None of it touched me. 100 years and none of it touched me. He looked up then, directly at me, with the steady, unguarded gaze of a man who has recently relearned the courage it takes to be seen. You brought me something to eat. You brought me something that said, you are a living thing, and living things need to be fed. Not impressed, not proven to, fed. He set the bread down gently on the table between us. Power is not what you take, he said. It is what you are willing to share. I looked at him across that simple wooden table, no throne, no court, no obsidian and ceremony, just a man and a kitchen and morning light, and I thought about every person in the barren valley who had shared what little they had when sharing it cost them something real. My mother, pressing seeds into bread she would never see do their work. My neighbors, splitting the last of the harvest so no single family went to bed with nothing. The quiet, unglamorous, daily heroism of people who had nothing to hoard and so had learned, out of sheer necessity, the only kind of power that actually sustains anything. Not the power of accumulation, the power of offering, the power of the open hand. Outside the window, the ivy kept growing, the first green shoots of something new pushing up through the courtyard stones. The kingdom, slowly, learning to breathe again. I picked up my half of the bread. He picked up his. And in the Amber-Glow Citadel, on a plain wooden table, with no witnesses and no ceremony and no gold in sight, we shared the first real meal the palace had seen in 100 years. It tasted like wood smoke and yeast and salt in my mother's hands. It tasted like the end of something and the beginning of everything. The gold and the emeralds and the blood gold weapons, all of it was useless. Not because it lacked value in the world's eyes, but because it could not fill a hollow heart. Only the bread did that. Only the thing offered with open hands and no expectation of return, made from seeds a dying woman guarded with her life, kneaded before dawn in a cold valley kitchen only that broke a century of darkness. True wealth is not found in what can be hoarded. It lives entirely in what you are willing to give away.